Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Jan Roshadams, the Vice President of U.S. Development with Join Mayshad. We are an ecosystem of brands for women by women, connect women to each other and to the companies, causes, and organizations that champion equity for women professionally and personally. Today, you're with us watching our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion show brought to you each and every Tuesday. Please make sure to check us out at our YouTube channel and also at joinmayshad.com to learn more about how you too can become a part of how together we revolutionize how professional women connect, engage, and do business together. So this is a really exciting day for us because we are celebrating 6 months of programming in the digital world. So happy anniversary to Mayshad. Yay! And we have a very special guest with us today, the CEO and President of the Harlem Education Activities Fund, Ruth Rathblott. Hi, Ruth. Welcome back.
Hi, Jan. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah. So, Ruth, we're celebrating our 6 months with you. You were one of our very first, within the first week, shows that we did digitally as we talked about all things related to COVID back in March. That's crazy to think about. 6 months have gone by.
And it's crazy to think that we had no idea what the next 6 months at that time would even look like, because as we think about it, we all thought it was going to be this 2-week holiday. And then, snow break, snow day. And it turned into much more. We stocked up on hot chocolate. We stocked up on pasta and stuff to make bread. And yeah, now it's the reality of, it's reality.
It's funny you say bread, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you at the end of the show, which I'm going to ask you now instead, is, thinking back on this time, it seems like we've all kind of picked up a new hobby to keep ourselves occupied and to make the time go past faster. Have you developed or picked up a new hobby during the last 6 months since we last talked?
Yeah, I think I've gotten much more into journaling and meditating. And I think that's, and I will say, at the beginning of this, and I may have shared this last time, I also made a conscious effort to get out of my house every day and go for a walk in Central Park. Even when it was lonely and not great weather, I made sure every day to get out and take a walk just for my mental health. And I think journaling and meditating has helped with that as well. So that's probably where I am. I didn't get into the baking bread piece. I didn't knit anything. I did do some vision boards, so I think that counts. But
that does count. Yeah. I love the idea about being outside, and I think for many of us, being outside in summer was really, really very important, even though we weren't necessarily taking vacations in the same way. Like, we had to really re-envision how we think about or thought about like spending quality time just with, people that are closest to us. But I think that as we move into the fall months now, as it starts to get colder, because some of us around the country have already experienced some pretty cold days, the importance of still feeling engaged and connected and getting fresh air, I think, is going to be incredibly vital for how we all get through this in the upcoming 4 or 5 months that will, because COVID's still here.
Absolutely. And I think the other piece that was helpful when I was taking those walks, to your point, is I took photos. And what I was able to do, I took photos of nature. And Jan, so many people, when I would post them on Facebook or Instagram, would say, thank you so much, because I'm not leaving my apartment, but it's so great to see that spring is coming. So great to see this is happening.
Wow.
So
That's really powerful.
Yeah, no. And people even said, I want to make a quilt out of your photos. Would that be okay? Can I blow them up for my wall? So I think that's the power of sharing, but also being able to be courageous to get outside and see what was happening, because spring was really beautiful, and it always is. And so not to be able to see it and feel it and smell it, I was able to offer that lens for people.
Also, I'm wondering, what have you learned about the work that you do over the last 6 months as well? Like, what's shifted, what's pivoted, what's changed? And then in what ways have you been able to stay true to the core values of what your mission is?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think this time has probably offered 3 core lessons. It's interesting. We had our gala last year where we honored Robert Smith, the head of Vista Equities. And at that point, that was last November, he challenged us to think about how to grow and use technology and really think about making it maximum effort and really just growing. And we never thought that we would be we had some ideas, we could use technology, it would be nice. But, as of March 13th, we were forced to use technology and really think about classes and education online for students, because the program I run is about getting students to and through college and providing them educational opportunities and exposure. And so we had to really be creative and pivot very quickly if we wanted to still maintain having students learn. So that was a big piece of it. And then I would say the second piece to it was the lens of racial equity and Black Lives Matter that started to really raise its head. I mean, I know those issues have been with us for a long time. I think, though, with Black Lives Matter, it was about really affecting the students that we work with, the families that we work with, and the staff that works with our students and families. And so really giving voice to how critical and important and serious equity issues are. And so that was a piece of the lens that probably should have been with us a long time, but that I would say broadened in perspective as we went through this. And then I think the third piece that we've thought a lot about is mental health. And what does that mean for the students we work with, for the families we work with? Most of our families are from low-income backgrounds. And so they already have stressors in terms of economic insecurity, food insecurity, housing insecurity. Layer on that COVID, equity issues, racial equity issues, and now you're really brewing a storm for people. And so I worry about the students I work with, I worry about the families, but honestly, Jan, I also worry about the staff that I work with, because the work is incredibly difficult and challenging and long. And so burnout for staff is something I'm thinking about a lot too. So I would say this time has been a perfect storm in terms of creating, I would say, really challenging times. But I will also say there's some silver linings in it as well, and some periods where you get to be innovative and you have to think differently. You have to pivot and think about things in different ways that we wouldn't have thought about before.
I would imagine so many questions from what you just said that I have. So I might feel like this is jumping around a bit, but wondering for you, as many nonprofits go into Q4, and particularly from December 1st on is usually a very heavy fundraising time for nonprofit organizations. And, is that true for your organization as well, in the sense of how you think about, gifts from individuals and major donors and foundations? And then if so, then in what way are things changed this year, or have they changed?
Yeah, they've definitely changed. So our fiscal year starts in July 1st, it ends June 30th. I would say that there's critical parts of fundraising that we are looking at. One is our gala, which we raise about half of our budget through our big event. It's typically held in the fall. It's in person. There's usually 500 to 700 people in person. We made a decision early on in April to say, I can't imagine in October/November that people are still even going to want to get together then at that big of a capacity. So we made a decision to go virtual. But it forced us to really look at, so what is interesting? What is HEAP about? HEAP is about building intellectual curiosity. It's about building love of learning, and it's about being innovative. And so our evening we titled this year to be on October 28th is an evening of innovators and disruptors. And so we then started reaching out to really influencers. And so I was able to connect with Fareed Zakaria, and he brought on Eric Schmidt, and the former head of Google, who's now tasked with rebuilding the city. So that's about innovation and thinking, how do we rebuild the city? I then connected with a very close friend of our organization, Roger Ferguson, the head of TIA-CREF, and said, you know what, we want to do a panel on disruption. What does disruption in education look like? And he brought forward Darren Walker and Ursula Burns, the former head of Xerox, and I should say Darren Walker, the head of the Ford Foundation. And so really interesting conversation that night. And so that wouldn't have been possible maybe before, because people have different schedules, people are in different locations, but because of technology, we're able to have a really interesting evening. We're also honoring one of our board members who's going to talk about the state of education and why HEAP is important. And we have Kool and the Gang performing. So that might not have happened.
That is so cool. Literally, that is so cool.
It's so cool. So and we have Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's on our board, and OJ Anderson co-emceeing the event. So it's, again, you make the best of what you have, but I think the best is even better because of this. I will also add that I think the immediate fundraising, I think what we started to see in the spring and summer went to COVID relief very quickly. And now there's a shift to racial equity, which is obviously absolutely where he fits in. But then what I'm starting to see with foundations and corporations is there's also a lens around education and the importance, especially in New York City, as we struggle to keep the school system open and what does it look like, and also mental health. And so I think Heath is in a really interesting position and a unique position to serve students and families in ways that blend the equity lens, the education lens, and the mental health lens. So I do think while it's going to be a tough year, I think that we're in a unique position, and I like the conversations that I'm having with funders about it.
So here's kind of a tricky question, Ruth, and I know that many nonprofits really rely on, their annual galas, their annual in-person events. And I remember in New York City around 2007, 2008 with the Great Recession, many nonprofits made a very conscious decision to move away from, events that may have cost, a couple $100,000 and move more toward intimate, still in person, obviously, but like in-person cocktail parties, because they wanted to ensure to their donors that they were using their donors' monies in the most efficient way possible to ensure that, most of the monies were still going to fund programs as opposed to admin or fundraising. And I'm wondering if, now, particularly because the economic impact of COVID is so much stronger and greater, and we see, 50, I'll just say close to 60 million Americans that have filed unemployment claims during this time, like that's affected, everyone from frontline essential workers to the C-suite and everything in between. Do you feel like funders are engaging and more enthused about supporting organizations like yours now in the digital space, because they also know that there's a greater percentage of every dollar that's going to fund programs, as opposed to, the fanciness that comes along with an in-person event?
I absolutely think that's true. In the conversations that I've been having with funders, they're looking at direct cost of programs, to your point. They're looking at what are good models. They're looking at who's pivoting and who's being innovative in this space. I think they're also looking at what does collaboration look like. So how are nonprofit partners working together to solve current issues, which has always been, a nice lofty goal, but now how are we actually doing it? Because there are nonprofits, unfortunately, that aren't in a position to be sustainable. So how do other nonprofits pick up some of that work? Part of what I've suggested to funders is also, if there are nonprofits who are serving youth in that middle school and high school and college space that aren't surviving, can Heath help out and utilize and work with those students? Because it's about coming together. I think, unlike 9/11, unlike Sandy, COVID has not allowed us to be together, but we have technology now that does allow us, and we have the ability to communicate with technology that allows us to come together. So it is a unique space. I do think funders are looking seriously at who they're funding in different ways now and who's sustainable. And that's, I think we're lucky at Heath that we concentrated in very heavy ways about our funding and diversifying our funding base over the last few years. And so making sure that we weren't relying on one funder or several funders, but really diversifying our individual giving, our corporate giving, our foundation giving, and even our event giving. I mean, we created an online event a few years ago, crowdfunding event that, we thought was going to raise $11,000, and it raised much more. And so just having those kind of pieces, and I have an amazing development director who thinks of those ideas with me and thinks of those ideas on her own. And I probably sometimes roll my eyes because I'm like, what? And then she makes it happen. And so I think it's about the relationship building we've been doing. It's about being innovative. And I think that's what funders are also looking for. So, yeah.
Do you think that also maybe to the point around, the long-term viability of an organization? I know that in the past, when I was in the nonprofit world, there was oftentimes a hesitancy and a resistance for nonprofits to partner together, because in many instances they were competing for the same funding, right? And so do you think now funders also have a better understanding of the complexities of the past, in the sense of what were some of the roadblocks to partnerships and collaborations and finding those common synergies? Or is it just COVID kind of really blown everything up?
It's probably, I mean, that's a great question. I think it's probably a combination of things, because I think as funders get more sophisticated with data and what outcomes look like for different nonprofits, I think they're using those lenses to make decisions. They're also introducing partners together without risk of taking away funding. So let's work on a joint project. We'll fund you at this level. We'll fund them at that level, so that you're not afraid to lose funding, because that's what kept us before, to your point. Like, there's only so many pieces of a pie. And so, if we partner with you, will you get the money and we won't? It's interesting. When I started at Heath 8 years ago, I created an event. My team came to me and wanted to celebrate our seniors graduating. And what was fascinating is I threw it out there. I said, well, could we partner with others to do an event? And they said, well, no, because then it wouldn't be about Heath. I'm like, well, maybe it's actually about college access and getting kids to college. And if we came together, people would see the power of bringing all of our students together and celebrating all of them, and celebrating the hard work of these organizations, because there's 1 million students in New York City who are low income, who want to get to college. Well, if Heath can't handle all of that, but together collectively, so we partner with over 20 to 25 organizations across New York City to celebrate students and their college acceptances on College Decision Day. So it's been an amazing event, a way to partner. And then we have networking opportunities. We build out activities for them during the year, for the students during the year, and workshops. And we come together as organizations. And I think there's power in our knowledge. There's power in our connections to others. There's power. And I think that's what funders are looking at too. Wow, you're really learning from each other. And that's the beauty. But I also think there's a need with COVID to do that in greater ways too. And I think that's your second part of your answer.
We talk a lot about the remoteness of life now, right? And the beautiful ways in which technology is bringing us all together, and has actually forced us to feel more comfortable with, you and I having this conversation, for example, which you and I never connected on screen. It was always in person in the past, right? So we think about the ways in which now we're staying connected with people that are important to us professionally and personally. We also know that during this time, there's an excess of the remoteness, right? Like we work remotely, we socialize remotely, we learn remotely. And so share with us, for you professionally and personally, what is it meant to be so remote as a leader, but then also just as a human being?
Yeah. And if it's okay, I'll take it in the reverse of personally, and then I'll go professionally. Because I had to get to a comfortable place with the remoteness. I think that what I experienced early on was definitely, like many of us, a real feeling of isolation, a lack of human connection, and a need, almost an increased need to be seen. And I started to really get sad about it, because it was very lonely. I live alone in New York City. It was that feeling of, yes, you could Zoom with friends and you Zoomed with work, but you were still not connecting with people. And if that's part of that was my daily and nightly life, was connecting with people. And so this idea of being very alone, I had to come to terms with the choices I'd made in my life, right? That got me to that place. Then realizing, what did I want my life to look like when this quote unquote was over, or how did I move through this? And I also had to come to terms with my own mental health. And that's where the idea of going for walks was important. That's where the idea of just even connecting more and asking people for help, in terms of, I need you to reach out to me daily. This is really tough. And so being vulnerable and asking for the support was a huge piece of it. Add on that, now leading a team who is now probably in many ways feeling much of the same, feeling isolated, feeling lack of connection. The students are our biggest smile bringer. That's the joy in our lives when they come to Heath. And so now leading a team through a crisis, and making sure, so we started out every day for the first, I guess it was March through June, and end of June, we had daily meetings at 10 o'clock every day, because I needed people to know, I was there. I needed to see them as well. And I could pick up at least on some of the things. If someone wasn't having a great day, I could call them after and check in on them. Because over the phone, you can mask some things. We're getting, I think the technology has allowed us, just like you and I, like you're saying, we either meet in person or over the phone. You can't really tell how someone's doing. You can't tell how they're dressed for the day. Are they putting themselves together to be on a Zoom call? So we made sure that we had Zoom calls every day for the first few months, and then we moved them as schedules started to change less frequently. But it was really important that we stayed connected in the beginning.
I want to go back to a couple of things you talked briefly about in the beginning of the conversation, just around the inequalities that have sprung up during COVID. And let's take that further and talk about just the remoteness of that and the extent to which safety nets are disappearing, which is then even further complicated by how you're seen, right? And what isn't going reported, what isn't going noticed. Let's talk a bit about that too, because I think that's really critical as we move into potentially phase 2.0 of COVID, to have more conversations about exactly that.
No, it's the thing that keeps me up at night, Jan. Honestly, it's I think about the students and families that I work with that were already under pressure. They were under stress of whether it be financial insecurity, whether it be food insecurity, whether it be shelter insecurity, and stressors, right? And there were mental health. Some families have mental health challenges. You add on that the layer of COVID, and it now is, I keep using the phrase, but it's a perfect storm for abuse. It's a perfect storm. And where, to your point about shelter and safety, after school programs and schools for many students were that safety zone. They were the place that noticed if you had not eaten that day. They were the place that noticed if your clothes were, torn or dirty. They were the place that noticed if you hadn't slept. And so, or if you had marks and abuse marks. So take that piece away. Now you have families that have COVID stressors with everybody in a house and fearful of what's outside. So there's a lockdown in the house. You're sharing rooms with many others. And I worry because, I see the reports from ACS that say abuse reportings have gone down. That's not realistic because what young child is going to call on their parent? Who's watching out for these kids? That's my big concern. And so as I think about it, it's with my staff, it's about checking in on students much more frequently. It's making sure that we are calling them, but it's also important that we see them. So when we're in classes, part of the rules that we learned pretty quickly we needed to establish, and we're still working on, is you have to have your camera on when you're in class because we can see you. That though brings up issues because some students are, ashamed sometimes of who else is in the room, ashamed of what else is going on behind them. And so they turn their cameras off and you don't get that lens to see them. So yeah, I worry a lot about students. And I worry, frankly, also about education for students because our students have technically been out of school. And while Zoom classes and, Google classes have worked for some students, they're not working for all students. And so you have students who really left school in March and we know summer learning loss is real, especially for students from low income backgrounds. So now you have March through June, you have June through August. You're now talking 6 months of learning loss, potentially 7 months. And the other piece, so it's the learning loss piece that scares me for kids. It's the mental health piece and what's happening in their families. And also what we know about kids and adolescents is they need to be with each other. That's healthy. It's social. It's normal for adolescents to connect with other adolescents. As much as this generation relies on their phone and texting, we know that it's important that they connect with each other. And if you are missing that, how are they developing? It's really makes I lose sleep at night because of it.
Ruth, what you're saying is so powerful on so many different levels, including the fact that I think that sometimes we make an assumption that because, when we think about children now, we think about, their attachment to their digital devices and how everything's a text, right? Or, TikTok or, whatever they're all doing now. But they're doing it together, usually in person, right? And so there's something that I think that adults aren't quite grasping in the sense of the understanding of the importance of the human connection.
Yeah, the human connection. I mean, I think it's relevant for all of us, but I think mostly because I work with teens that I know it's important for their development, for their healthy development, to be with each other and to connect and to have those and individuate from their parents. And so, yeah, this is, I think there are going to be long lasting effects on mental health because of COVID. Obviously, because students aren't able to connect. I know students are resilient and they're strong, but this is a lot of pressure and a lot of isolation that isn't healthy for any of us.
I want to shift gears for a second, and then come back to many of the themes that we were talking about. But I want to make sure that we have time to talk about National Disability Employment Awareness Month, which is the month of October. Talk to us a bit about why this is so important to you and what's different about this year.
Yeah, well, it's the 30th anniversary, and it's funny when I've talked to friends about the ADA getting passed 30 years ago. I was 21, and it's interesting, and I would say funny, but it's not really funny to think that I grew up for 21 years of my life not being protected as a class. I was born, as I've shared with you, with a limb difference, and I have definitely I hid my, as I've shared I think in the past with you, I hid my hand for 24 years of my life, so half of my life. And I don't know that until this year I really understood, when I started to really research the ADA and the impact of what it was like before, because I think many of us have grown up just assuming that the ADA was always in place, but when I've talked to friends, they're like, "Oh, it was probably in the 70s." I'm like, "No, it was 1990," and that's crazy. I mean, the fact that you could be forced to leave a wheelchair behind, the fact that you could be refused service in a restaurant, the fact that even going to a grocery store, all the things that we take are so normalized in our life, and the fact that even you could be discriminated against with jobs, that seems crazy. That even in my short life, I'd like to think of it as short, like that reality. I mean, at 21, I was celebrating being able to have some freedoms, right? But the fact that at 21, it was also a freedom to realize that I wasn't going to be discriminated against because of my disability. So that's what this means to me now. And the fact that it's 30 years, I think, is momentous. I do think there's so many things that I'm proud of because of it. And yet there's so many things that need to be changed.
Let's talk about from your perspective, what would you like to see change?
Yeah, I mean, I think the things that have changed are good in terms of how we, that it's recognized that when we think about, you go into a hotel or you think about architecture, that's changed. You think about transportation and communication, those things have changed. I think there's still a real need to call out attention to disability. The statistic I've heard is that 20% of people have some form of disability. And I've even heard recently, Jan, that COVID at some point may be marked as a long-term disability because of the health effects of people who have suffered through it. So I think about, there's still a stigma and stereotype in some ways attached around employment. I know that when we look for talent, we don't always think about disability as one of the key aspects of diversity that we should look for in talent. I think that even in mainstream culture, we're just starting to see the beginnings of companies supporting people with disabilities making their mark. Whether it's, I think about the Seattle Seahawks who drafted Shaquem Griffith a year ago, or the Rockettes who for the first time in their history brought on someone like myself with a limb difference, Sydney, or the young girl who helped influence Mattel and Barbie an American Girl doll to start to have representation even in dolls. And I think that's important. I also think that when we think about corporations and CEOs, I think there's still a lack of people with disabilities represented. And that is, I think, in part, Jan, because I think the statistic is 7% of business leaders will admit to having a disability, whereas actually it's 20% that actually do, or 15% that actually do. And then I think 20% don't actually even own it. Like I also think, there's a part of what got me interested in this journey and speaking about disability was the idea of diversity. And when we think about diversity, we often think through the lens of race, we think through the lens of gender, and even now sexual orientation. And what I don't often hear is visible differences and invisible differences. I hear, and so I think there's still a lot of work to be done in that space. And while companies, I think the statistic is 90% of companies prioritize diversity as a key component of their work structure and their workflow and a value, only 4% actually verbalize and prioritize disability in those conversations. So I think there's definitely some work that needs to be done. I mean, I'd love to see the C-suite much more engaged with disability. So that's where my voice comes in. Is my passion project is about broadening the definition of diversity to be more inclusive.
And I think also to encourage leaders to be more courageous and more fearless in how they talk about their own visible and invisible disabilities. Ruth, I'd love to get your insight more on kind of the nuances in the sense of how that plays out then in the workplace, both for employees and for leaders, in the sense of the division between how you define a visible versus an invisible disability.
Yeah, I think visible disabilities, I mean, I definitely categorize myself as having a visible difference. And yet I hid it for so long. So somebody might not know that, right? It's about awareness. It's about owning it. I think it was up to me to be proactive in terms of owning it. I think the visible differences are the ones obviously that you can see, like mine, like a limb difference. The invisible differences can be everything from mental health to someone's background of what's they're carrying shame around, what they're hiding and covering, that they're not sharing out at work, that may also impact their work life and work style. And I think as I look at part of my journey is also how did different managers in my life talk to me about my difference and create space so that I was comfortable, or how did I create comfort so that somebody else could have a conversation with me about it. So I think that's a piece of it. One of the things, Jan, that is a little bit shocking about the ADA, and even with their coverage, and I think I have this right, is that companies that are less than 15 employees and don't operate 20 weeks a year don't have to follow the ADA. So small business still has some barriers around the protection. And while I somewhat understand it because small businesses are tasked with a lot, I think that that's a piece of where we still need to go with the ADA as well. And I think small business and large business have an opportunity to really hire and employ people with disabilities. But to your question too, I think the invisible can be just as hard to talk about at work. And I do see some CEOs starting to talk about mental health and starting to even share out their own mental health stories.
Carson Pickett teamed up with Nike recently. And from one of your reflections from one of your LinkedIn posts, you wrote about the experience that you had with your father trying to teach you how to tie your shoes growing up, right? And she talked about a similar experience and how she now thinks about a collaboration with Nike. And you wrote about how that experience and just, the experience of being disabled has really taught you to think outside the box. And because of that, then is enabled you to be a really creative problem solver. And that's one space where you think leaders and companies could really learn from, in the sense of how they think about hiring and recruiting and incorporating, to your point, in the language of what it means to be disabled within their larger DEI context.
Absolutely. No, that article about Carson and Nike was, I think it's funny. I got a lot of reaction from people who have limb differences about that, because we all had to go through that growing phase of learning how to tie your shoe, because that in the days when we were growing up, they didn't have the slip-on shoes. They didn't have the Velcro shoes. So you had to learn how to tie a shoe. And my father sat patiently with me, trying to show me the bows and I think there were bunnies involved or some kind of And I had to ask him at 5 years old, I'm like, let me just figure it out. Let me try. And that has kind of been my motto throughout my life. Whether it's trying to hold, if I go to a reception and trying to hold a drink and a plate and have to shake someone's hand, it's having to think 2 or 3 steps ahead always. Like, how am I going to hand them my business card when I can't get to my purse? How am I going to figure all of that out? And so I think people with differences absolutely have to always be thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead, whether it's a physical difference, an invisible difference, or an invisible difference. You're always wondering how you're going to problem solve. How are you going to open the door? How are you going to do something? Carry all the things, and at the same time, take a selfie. Like, you have to be thinking all the time. And what's amazing is, I think the other side of it is that people make assumptions about people with ability challenges that they can't. And so, but not giving people I mean, it's funny. I had a staff person come to me. She wanted to hire someone a few years ago for a administrative position, a basic office administrator. And one of the candidates, she said, well, this person looks really good, but I talked to them on the phone and we're not going to move forward with them. And I said, oh, tell me why. And she said, well, they have a stutter. I said, oh, well, let's explore that a little bit. Why would that be? Why wouldn't we hire them? And she said, well, it might impede on their work. I said, well, let's look at their resume. Like, their resume is filled with amazing positions that they've held. It wasn't just, 6 months and then they left each job. She had a long history of work. I said, but we need to challenge the assumption about what she's capable of, because truthfully, I'm glad I interviewed before you got hired. I said, because you might have made assumptions about me and my ability. And I'm just wondering and curious, who carries more boxes in this place that I do? And she's like, I know, you're right. And so we had that conversation, but I think it's about challenging assumption, because especially about ability, whether it's about, again, visible differences or invisible differences. I would rather every time, Jan, be asked, can you do this, or do you want to do this, than someone make a choice for me to say, oh, you can't do this. So I do think it's up to employers and managers and staff, peers, to challenge their own assumptions about people with abilities, to realize that people with disabilities and differences have always had to think outside the box and be creative, and challenge themselves to think about those as their fellow employees, rather than, oh, I don't want it. I don't want that. That won't work here. Why? And make it meaningful. I think, again, we have a long way to go, but I do think there's opportunity to kind of challenge the assumptions we have.
Ruth, I can't help but wonder also if this is, given everything that COVID's kind of bubbled up to the surface again, that this is also a time to start to have really uncomfortable conversations, right? Because I think that when we think about race, class, gender, sexuality, age, ability, disability, we often don't know what to say because we don't know what we don't know, right? And so to your point, we make assumptions and judgments, not having checked our own stuff in at the door before we come into the room. So a large part of this is really feeling like we're in trusted spaces for everyone on all sides of the table to be able to start to have some of those uncomfortable conversations where it actually helps us to learn and grow as individual human beings, but then also as team members in a way we may have shied away in the past because we didn't want to ruffle feathers or feel like we were stepping outside of, what was appropriate, or what, even from an HR perspective, I think that, honestly, I think that one of the detriments of the hashtag Me Too movement became a backlash in how, unfortunately, men became to feel not comfortable around women in the workplace, honestly, right? And so we saw this backlash in the sense of, Me Too ultimately meant empowerment and liberation and using your voice and using your voice in a way that, is you're standing up for yourself and you're standing up for other women, you're doing what's right. But there was a significant negative backlash associated with that. And I'm wondering if because of things like that happen that really intend to move our society forward, but then move them back in some way, if people don't speak up because they just are afraid of, of exploring, or afraid of like getting messy to get to a better place. Do you know what I mean? Like, is there part of that happens as well?
I think, it's interesting. I think there's a few thoughts. One is, I think you're right about the Me Too movement. I think I started to hear it from both women and men, like men saying, "Oh, I don't want to go to lunch alone with her because I don't know what she's going to say. And I'm not including her in a meeting with all other guys because we don't know what she's going to say." To women saying, "Feel really uncomfortable because I know how to have conversations, and, you know, are they going to think those things of me? Am I going to be invited to those pieces? Can I still joke around? Can I still have conversation? How do I need to act too?" So I think it was, while it was it is an important movement in terms of allowing women to have voice when they feel unheard and when they feel victimized. I think that to any movement, I think there's a pendulum, right? There's pieces that are really positive and supportive and intense that need to happen. And then unfortunately, there's also the other side where it swings back and it's almost like, well, we're not going to ever have lunch with another woman again if I'm a man. Well, that's not healthy and that's not realistic. And it puts women back in a space, right, of that they're not included. I am concerned about Black Lives Matter in that sense too, in terms of how do we keep the voice raised, and how do we make sure that it is raised to move it forward so that students that I work with have opportunities that they may not have had in the past? How do I make sure that we are challenging assumptions? And I think you're right. You have to challenge your own assumptions personally, right? You have to do the work yourself, because there's a lot that I didn't know about Black Lives Matter and racial equity that I wasn't going to ask my staff to teach me. I needed to do my homework outside and learn myself. And my biggest lesson that I said this when we started these conversations at work, was I needed to listen, because while I'm the CEO and that's an important role, I needed in this space to listen to what were some of the things, where were the pain points that people were feeling, what were some of the things they wanted to do to change. And I think smartly, and we'll see how it moves forward, brought in an outside consultant to help us do the work together, because I knew that I wasn't equipped to do it myself. And I didn't think it was appropriate. So I brought in someone outside to help us move through the conversations and really have good and somewhat messy conversations about diversity. Because you're right, it's not always pretty, and it is challenging, and it is tough, and it's messy. But how could we move through it together? But it was up to me to understand what I didn't know. It was up to me to check my pieces. And I would say it was also up to me to share my own difference. And that important to me, diversity also means disability. And so when we're talking through that lens, I want to make sure that I feel included as well. But I do think for the students I work with and the staff I work with, it was absolutely important to really focus on racial equity and racial justice. And that I needed to learn a lot, and I needed to listen a lot.
Ruth, the BBC premiered last week Cripstale, which are 6 short films about fictionalized life-changing moments for those who are disabled. All of the actors, the writers, the directors, the producers are all disabled themselves. And this show, this short series, was conceptualized as a response to the fact that I think the percentage is about 95% of roles for disabled people in film and TV are actually played by non-disabled actors. What are your thoughts about that? And is this a moment in time for more content like that to be produced? I'm just wondering, what you think about it. For me personally, I was shocked to hear that percentage, but then I thought that actually makes sense given where we are as a country. But how, as you think about just, popular culture and, the importance of seeing people who are like you, represented in spaces and places where, we realize that they aren't. And Hollywood and TV, we could, that's a whole different show in the sense of what's wrong, what's wrong there from a race perspective, from a gender perspective, from a class perspective. But I thought that the work that the BBC is doing, I thought is really, really interesting. I wanted to get your take on it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it is a moment in time. I think that we are on the cusp of people starting to realize what we haven't paid attention to for a while. I mean, I know, thinking back over my life, I can name probably 2 come to mind /3 people who had disabilities that you actually saw on TV, right? We all know Marlee Matlin and her hearing challenge. And there may have been somebody on Facts of Life, I remember, but it was so far and few between that I never saw myself on TV. And it's interesting, Jan, I was having a conversation a few months ago with someone about race and how it was portrayed on TV and in movies, et cetera. And my response back was, I have nothing to fight against because I've never actually seen myself portrayed on TV. And so I would love the ability at some point to see myself or to see someone who looked like me so that I could say it was normal. Because I still get people who stare saying, the body's natural response is to see things lined up, right? To have alignment. So when people see my hand, sometimes there's stares and it's, oh, wait, they're trying to figure out what's missing. So the staring part is hard. I think your point about the series is important because it's showing also it's challenging assumptions that people with disabilities can't act, right? That's the assumption, or they can't direct, or nobody would want to watch it. And so my hope is that with this, it starts to spur other things. I mean, it's similar to Sydney, who I mentioned before for the Rockettes. I mean, who would have ever thought that somebody with one hand would be part of the Rockettes? Well, why wouldn't she be? Because we have this idea of what perfection looks like or what body image looks like. So I do hope that it's a moment that doesn't stop. And I hope that at some point, my thought is, and I've thought this every year for the last few years at the Oscars, why isn't anyone saying so able-bodied? Like, why isn't that a conversation or a hashtag that people are not concerned about? Because I'm concerned about it. Like I'm concerned about representation in many forms. But it should be something that we think about in terms of visibility for people and conversation.
Ruth, for those of us who are watching today, business owners, entrepreneurs, innovators, executives, how can we help support the work that you do?
Yeah, so I have my professional life, right? My personal life and my professional life. I think with my organization, I think it's getting involved in volunteering and making equity one of the cornerstones of the platform in thinking about the students that I work with and how do we provide opportunity and access to worlds. And I think those same terms are relevant also for the disability piece of my space. Also, I think with a disability space, I think the conversations to what we were talking about before we need to create safe places to have those conversations. We need it to come from CEOs that it's an important value, but it needs to come from hiring managers. It needs to come from employees. Like it needs to be, and people with disabilities also need to own and be part of the conversation. So I think that it's creating space to your question. I think it's creating space to have those challenging conversations. And I think it's also committing and pledging. I mean, I think there's a really amazing woman. Her name is Caroline Casey, and she started something called the Valuable 500. And it's about companies pledging that disability is important and that board seats for people with disabilities is important because it's a lens. It's also about having people, I'll just say one quick story that this young woman, Jordan Reeves, who worked with Mattel and looked at creating dolls with disabilities like Barbie, et cetera. She was in the room when they had been creating it. And then she was in the room and she said, it's interesting. Your prosthesis that you're putting on this doll is attached to Barbie. And they said, yeah, well, nobody with a prosthesis would ever have it attached to their body. Like you'd be able to take it off. And having people in the room who actually have disabilities or have differences, whatever it is so critical to how products get identified. I mean, whether it's your point about Nike or whether it's Zappos even. I mean, I think about Zappos and the fact that you can buy one shoe from Zappos if you're missing a limb. That's incredible. I mean, or the accessibility that Tommy Hilfiger is doing with clothing. Like it's thinking outside the box. And the truth is, when we think about people with disabilities, the inventions that we create for them are actually things that help everybody. Whether it be, the Bluetooth that we wear because it was a hearing aid idea, like how do we get people hearing? That's why we're all walking around with those AirPods or, Bluetooth devices. Like it's because of disability. So it's thinking outside the box. It's including people in the conversation so that you're making the right decisions.
Ruth, thank you so much for spending our 6-month digital anniversary with us. We couldn't have picked a better time to have this conversation, and so very excited to see you. We have one second for our lightning round, which is one of my favorite parts of the show. You ready?
Yeah.
If 2020 were 3 words or less, what would they be?
Oh, wow. Challenging, silver linings.
Oh, I like that. That's beautiful. What are you binge watching right now?
Oh, that is good. So I turned off my TV when this started because I couldn't take the COVIDness of everything. But I did go through the Tiger Kings. I went through the show. I went through Unorthodox. And I'm trying to think. I just started Narcos, and because everyone's told me how incredible it is, scared me. So I don't know how much I'll be into it. But yeah, I definitely went through my binge watching phase, and now I'm into reading because I forgot about books again. Like, books are great, especially hardcover real books. It's nice to have.
Well, you know what, and magazines too, right? Like, I think that there's something so valuable now about the physical touch of something, right? That's not just a screen that you flip through and scroll through.
Brain is meant to handle that much screen time. So,
exactly. Last question. What advice would you give to your 85-year-old self today?
Ooh, 85. Enjoy the ride, like travel as much as you can. Gratitude. I think it's, travel, gratitude, and love with your full heart. Like, just, I think if anything I learned from COVID is, love with your full heart, and take this as an adventure and time to learn. And I would say when I'm 85, I hope I look back and say, wow, you had some amazing adventures. You had some amazing love, and you are grateful for everything you got to see, because this world is awesome. And I can't wait to get back on a plane and travel.
You and me both, Ruth. Thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Jan Mercer-Dahms, the Vice President of U.S. Development with Join Mayshad. Again, please make sure to join us at joinmayshad.com, and you too can become a part of how we together create a new world where women are networking, creating business opportunities, and connecting in really meaningful, heartfelt conversations. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.